The laughter died in the space of a single heartbeat, and what replaced it was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. A chair scraped back across the polished concrete floor of the dining facility at Fort Renwick, loud as a rifle bolt slamming home, and every head in that crowded mess hall turned toward the sound. Sergeant First Class Eli Brandt was on his feet. He had not decided to stand. His body had simply done it, the way a body stands when something sacred walks into the room, and his coffee had sloshed over the rim of his cup and run unnoticed down the back of his hand. He was staring at a thin old woman in a faded denim jacket, a woman whose lunch tray had just clattered to the floor while 200 soldiers howled, and his face had gone the color of ash, because he had seen the inside of her left forearm. He had seen the small, blue-green tattoo there, worn soft by 50-some years of sun and time, a little hooded lantern with a date beneath it and 3 words he had recited to brand new medics more times than he could count. And Eli Brandt understood, in that suspended and terrible moment, exactly who he was looking at. He understood that the frail woman the entire room had just mocked was the single most decorated person any of them would ever stand near, that not one of them had known her name, and that he himself had taught her legend to children who were laughing at her right now. Before I take you back to how this started, do me a favor. Stay with me all the way to the end of this one, because the ending is the whole reason I'm telling it. Tap that like button so this story reaches the people who need to hear it. And leave a comment telling me what city or town you're watching from, because I genuinely want to see how far this travels. Now let's rewind, all the way back to a Friday morning that began like every other Friday at Fort Renwick. The dining facility at Fort Renwick was a long, low building of pale brick that sat at the center of the post like a heart, and on the last Friday of every month it did something most chow halls never did. It opened its doors to the town. The town was Calder, a small worn place of feed stores and a single stoplight, and Calder had been feeding its sons and daughters into Fort Renwick for the better part of a century. So somewhere back in the 1970s, some forgotten post commander had started a tradition, the Community Veterans Lunch, where any veteran who could prove they had served could walk through the line on the last Friday and eat a hot tray of the same gray and green Army food the soldiers ate, free of charge. Most months it drew a handful of old men in ball caps stitched with the names of ships and divisions and wars. They came for the food, sure, but mostly they came for the smell. There is a particular smell to a military kitchen, steamed vegetables and industrial coffee and bleach and hot steel, and for men who had spent the best and worst years of their lives inside that smell, walking back into it was a way of touching the past without getting cut on it. The dining facility was ruled, body and soul, by Master Sergeant Della Frost. Della was 51 years old, built like a fireplug, and possessed of a voice that could stop a forklift at 40 yards. She had been running Army kitchens for 29 years, and in that time she had developed exactly zero tolerance for waste, foolishness, or anybody touching the dessert line before they had eaten a vegetable. She patrolled her domain with a serving spoon held like a field marshal's baton, and the young soldiers feared her in the specific way you fear a force of nature that also controls whether you get the good pudding. On Community Fridays, if you watched closely, you'd catch her sliding an extra portion onto an old veteran's tray, or pulling out a chair for a man whose knees had given up somewhere around the First Gulf War. She would have denied it under oath. That Friday morning, the line was already moving when Specialist Tyler Voss and his crew claimed the long table by the window. Voss was 23, lean and loud, with the kind of restless confidence that comes from being good at exactly enough things to never have been humbled. He had been in the Army for 3 years, none of them spent anywhere worse than a training range, and he carried himself like a man who had already seen the elephant when in truth he had only ever seen the brochure. Beside him sat Private First Class Danny Okafor, quieter, kinder, the sort of young man who laughed at Voss's jokes a half-second late because he was checking first whether they were cruel. And across from them, sprawled with his boots half into the aisle, was Private Mason Cobb, who laughed at everything loudly and meant none of it, and would have followed Voss off a cliff if Voss promised the fall would be funny. "Last Friday of the month, boys," Voss announced, dragging a forkful of eggs into his mouth. "Geezer Day. Place is gonna fill up with grandpas telling us about Nam. Set your watches." Cobb snorted. Okafor said nothing and looked at his tray. The morning rolled forward in its ordinary way. The line shuffled. Della Frost barked. The young soldiers ate and joked and complained about a field exercise coming up the following week. And at 11 minutes past 11, the double doors at the front of the dining facility swung open, and Opal Hartwell stepped inside. She was small and she was old, and the first thing you noticed was how carefully she moved, as if the floor might shift under her without warning. 78 years had folded themselves into her, into the curve of her spine and the thin silver hair pinned back from a face mapped with soft, deep lines. She wore a denim jacket that had been washed so many times it had gone the pale gray of a winter sky, and underneath it a simple blouse and sensible shoes, and she carried a canvas tote bag clutched against her side with both hands the way you carry something you can't afford to lose. She paused just inside the doors and blinked against the brightness, and she looked, to anyone glancing over, exactly like what Voss had been waiting for. A lost old woman who had wandered somewhere she didn't belong. She had not wandered. She had driven 40 minutes that morning from a rented room in Calder, and she had sat in the parking lot for 20 more before she found the nerve to come inside. She had been finding the nerve for 3 weeks, but none of that showed on her face. What showed was a small, polite uncertainty, the look of a person trying to figure out a system that everyone around her already understood. A young cook named Private Sosa spotted her from behind the line and waved her over with a smile that hadn't yet been worn down by the army. "Right this way, ma'am. You a veteran?" "I am," Opal said. Her voice was quiet but not weak. "Is that the line?" "That's the line. Grab a tray right there, you go down. Point at whatever looks good." Sosa winked. "Even the stuff that doesn't look good. It tastes worse, but it's free." Opal smiled at that, a real smile, and reached for a tray from the stack. And here is where the morning began to tilt. The trays at Fort Renwick were the new kind, molded plastic with shallow compartments, slick and warm from the dishwasher and stacked too high for a woman of her height to manage with a tote bag on her arm. She set the bag down between her feet, took a tray in both hands, and started down the line, and her hands, which had once been the steadiest hands in a building full of dying men, trembled now with the small constant tremor of age. The serving line clattered and steamed. She pointed at the meatloaf, at the green beans, at a roll. A scoop of mashed potatoes landed in a compartment and slid toward the edge. And then, at the very end, where the line opened back into the dining room, the tray tipped. It wasn't dramatic. It was the smallest thing. Her grip slipped, the weight shifted, and the tray canted forward and dumped meatloaf and gravy and a half pint of milk across the floor in a wet brown splash that spread out toward the nearest tables. The plastic tray landed flat with a crack that echoed off the high ceiling. For 1 second there was quiet, and then Mason Cobb laughed. It was a bark of a laugh, sharp and delighted. The laugh of a young man who has been bored all morning and has just been handed something to do, and it gave permission to 100 other laughs. The sound rolled across the dining facility in a wave. Soldiers who hadn't even seen what happened turned and grinned because grinning was easier than not. Voss leaned back in his chair and clapped slowly, 3 times, and called out across the room, "Need a hand there, Grandma? Or you want to take out the whole salad bar while you're at it?" The laughter swelled. Opal Hartwell stood very still in the middle of the spreading mess, an empty tray in her shaking hands, 200 faces turned toward her. And she did the thing that nobody expected, the thing that would have told them everything if any of them had been paying attention. She did not flush. She did not crumble. She did not flee. She looked down at the spill with a calm, assessing steadiness. Then she set the tray on the rail, crouched with one hand on her knee, and began, slowly, to pick the larger pieces up off the floor with a napkin. As if cleaning up a casualty. As if there were always going to be a mess, and the only question was who was going to start dealing with it. Oh no, no, no. Della Frost came around the end of the serving line at a speed that should not have been possible for a woman of her dimensions. A roll of paper towels already in one fist and her serving spoon abandoned somewhere behind her. "Ma'am, you put that down. You hear me? You sit. Sosa, get a mop and get out here." She dropped to her own knees beside Opal, and her voice, when she spoke again, had dropped to something almost gentle, a tone none of her soldiers would have recognized. I got it, Han. You go find yourself a seat and I'll bring you a fresh one. On the house, which it already was, but still." Opal looked at her. "I made the mess. I'll help with it." "You will absolutely not." Della Frost stood, and turned, and her gentleness evaporated as she rounded on the room, and the serving spoon was somehow back in her hand. "Who laughed?" she roared. "Which one of you ate baby food until you were 6 years old and laughed at a veteran in M.Y. Chow Hall?" The laughter cut off. But it was too late, and everyone knew it was too late, because the cruelty had already happened. It had landed and done its work, and an apology from a mess sergeant could not unspill it. Voss had the decency to look at the table. Cobb was still grinning, but uncertainly now, the grin sliding off his face 1 degree at a time. Only Danny Okafor was already up, halfway across the room with a stack of napkins, going to help, his ears burning red, but the distance between his table and the spill suddenly felt enormous, and he wished, with everything in him, that he had gotten up before the laughing instead of after. Della Frost guided Opal toward a clean table near the window, 2 tables down from where Voss and his crew sat, and pulled out a chair. Opal sat and folded her trembling hands on the tabletop and waited, and her eyes moved once around the room, taking in the exits, the spacing of the tables, the position of every soldier, an old reflex she had never lost and never thought about, before they came to rest on the middle distance. She did not look angry. She looked patient. She looked like a woman who had waited out far worse than this and knew that everything passes if you simply refuse to be moved. "Now I want you to understand what was about to happen because it turns on a single small thing, and the single small thing was salt." Della Frost brought a fresh tray, loaded heavier than regulation allowed, and set it down with a flourish and a muttered apology and a promise that she'd find out who laughed if it took her the rest of her natural life. And Opal thanked her and picked up her fork and found the meatloaf bland, which it was, and reached across the table for the salt shaker. It was a simple motion, an old woman reaching for salt. But to reach it, she had to extend her left arm fully across the table, and the loose sleeve of her denim jacket slid back from her wrist, and the fluorescent light fell across the soft pail inside of her forearm, and there, faded into the skin, blue gone almost green with age, was a small tattoo. It was a hooded field lantern, the kind soldiers had carried into the dark for 100 years, drawn in simple lines by a hand that had clearly not been a professional artist. Beneath it was a date, and beneath the date were 3 words in plain block letters worn soft by time. Sergeant First Class Eli Brandt was sitting 14 feet away with a coffee halfway to his mouth, and he saw it. Eli Brandt was 44 years old, and he had been a combat medic for 22 of them. He had 2 tours in his memory that he did not discuss and a third he sometimes did, and for the last 6 years his job at Fort Renwick had been to take young soldiers and turn them into people who could keep a wounded man alive in the worst minutes of that man's life. He taught tactical combat casualty care. He taught how to stop a bleed and seal a chest and drag a body out of a kill zone, and he taught it the way it had been taught to him, with stories, because stories are how soldiers remember the things that matter. And there was one story Brandt told every single class on the first day, before he taught them anything technical at all. He told them the story of Lantern. He did not know her real name. Nobody who told the story knew her real name, because it had come down through 50 years of medics the way folk songs come down through 50 years of singers. Changed a little in every mouth but true in the heart of it. The story went like this. Long ago, in a war his students' grandfathers had fought, there was a forward evacuation hospital in the Central Highlands, a cluster of tents and sandbags and a helipad scratched out of red dirt, and one night the enemy came through the wire in force. Sappers in the dark. The generators went down in the first minutes and the whole compound dropped into blackness lit only by tracer fire and burning fuel, and the wounded, the ones already there and the new ones falling everywhere, lay screaming in a darkness nobody could move through. Except one person did. A young army nurse who, when the lights died, took a single hooded battle lantern, the kind you could shield to a thin blade of light, and walked out into the open. And she went to the wounded. She found them by sound and by touch and by that thin blade of light, and she dragged them, 1 and 2 at a time, back toward the one tent that still had a surgeon in it, and then she went back out. And again. All night. The men who could see her coming said the same thing in the years afterward, in the bars and the reunions and the VA waiting rooms. They said, when you saw the lantern coming for you, you knew you were going to live. And the creed, the thing Brandt wrote on the whiteboard on the first day of every class, the thing every medic he had ever trained carried with them into their own dark nights, came from her. Because when the surgeon, exhausted and out of his mind with it, had finally screamed at her near dawn to stop, to stay inside, that she could not save them all. She had looked at him and said the only thing she ever said about any of it. She said, "Then I'll bring as many as I can." And she went back out. Bring them all. That was the creed. That was the tattoo. A hooded lantern. A date. And 3 words. Bring them all. Eli Brandt had taught that story for 6 years, believing the woman in it had died 50 years ago. Or that she had maybe never been one woman at all, but a legend stitched together out of a dozen brave nurses. And now he was sitting 14 feet away in a chow hall on an ordinary Friday, watching a frail old woman reach for the salt, and he was looking at the lantern and the date and the 3 words, inked into the skin of an arm that was actually attached to an actual living person who had actually been there. And his body stood up before his mind could catch it. The chair scraped, the coffee spilled, and the room, which had only just settled back into its noise after Della Frost's roar, went quiet a second time, because there is nothing a mess hall full of soldiers notices faster than a senior NCO standing at rigid attention for no reason anyone can see. Brandt's voice, when it came, was not loud. It carried because the room had gone silent enough to carry a whisper. "Ma'am," he said, and his throat worked around the word. "Ma'am, may I ask you about your tattoo?" Opal Hartwell set down the salt. She looked at the sergeant standing at attention beside his table with his eyes too bright, and something passed over her face, some old door opening that she had kept shut for a very long time, and she pulled her sleeve back down over her wrist with 2 fingers, slowly, the way you cover something private. "It's just an old tattoo," she said. "Got it a long time ago." "It's a lantern," Brandt said. "There's a date under it. November 9th. He swallowed. "And 3 words. The room was holding its breath now. Voss had turned in his seat. Cobb's grin was entirely gone. Walter Crane, in his corner by the door, had set down his coffee cup with a hand that had started, very slightly, to shake, and he was leaning forward, and his old eyes were fixed on the woman by the window as if she might dissolve. "Sergeant," Opal said gently, "you're making a scene over an old woman's arm." "Bring them all," Brandt said, and Opal Hartwell closed her eyes. For a moment she didn't say anything. The whole dining facility, 200 soldiers and a handful of old veterans and 1 mess sergeant frozen mid-stride with a mop bucket, watched an old woman sit with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the table, and not one of them breathed. When she opened her eyes they were wet, but her voice was steady, the same steady voice that had once told a screaming surgeon she would bring as many as she could. "How do you know those words?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "Because I teach them," Eli Brandt said. "I've taught them to every medic who's come through this post for 6 years. I teach them the story of a nurse at an evac hospital who went out into the wire with a lantern the night the generators died and brought back more men than anybody could count, and who said she'd bring as many as she could and went back out." His voice cracked clean in half. "We call her Lantern, ma'am. We don't know her name. Nobody knows her name. I thought she was dead. I thought maybe she was never even real." Opal Hartwell looked at him for a long moment. And then she looked, slowly, around the room, at all the young faces turned toward her, at Voss who had laughed, at Cobb who had laughed loudest, at the cooks frozen behind the line, at the old men in their ball caps who had risen, one by one, from their tables without being told to, and were standing now the way Brandt was standing. "I'm real," she said quietly. "Or I was. My name is Opal. And I was very real on the 9th of November. A long time ago." Walter Crane stood up in his corner so fast he knocked his chair over backward, and it hit the floor with a crash that made everyone jump. And he said, in a voice cracked and broken and enormous, "Opal!" And he came across that dining facility floor faster than his old legs should have carried him, weaving between the tables, one hand out in front of him as if to ward off the possibility that he was wrong. "Opal Rhodes? Is that, my God, is that you? Tell me that's you." And Opal Hartwell, who had been Opal Rhodes the night the wire broke, who had married a quiet man named Hartwell 12 years after the war and buried him the spring before last and come back to the only smell on earth that ever felt like home, looked up at the old man stumbling toward her, and her composure finally broke all at once, the way a dam breaks, and she put her shaking hand to her mouth. "Walter," she whispered. "Walter Crane. They told me you didn't make it. Now I need you to understand who Walter Crane was, because Walter was the reason the legend was true and the reason the truth had been buried. And the 2 of them, The old man and the old woman, gripping each other's hands and weeping in the middle of a stunned mess hall, were about to crack open a 50-year-old wrong in front of 200 witnesses. Walter Crane had been 19 years old on the 9th of November. A rifleman brought into the evac hospital that afternoon with a gut wound from a patrol gone wrong, lying on a litter in the dark when the sappers came through the wire. He remembered the lights dying. He remembered the screaming. He remembered being certain, with the flat, calm certainty of a boy who has accepted that he is going to die, that this was the end. And then he remembered the lantern. A thin blade of light, moving low across the ground, coming closer, and behind it a young woman's voice saying his name off his chart, saying, "Crane, Walter Crane. Look at the light, soldier. Look at the light and don't you look anywhere else." And he had looked at the light, and she had dragged him by the collar across 40 feet of open dirt while rounds cracked the air over both of them, put him down inside the surgical tent, packed his wound with her own hands, and then stood up and walked back out into the dark toward the next one, and the lantern had gone with her. Walter Crane had spent the rest of his life looking for the woman with the lantern. He had written letters. He had gone to reunions. He had stood up at veterans' meetings and told the story and asked, every time, "Does anybody know her name?" And the answer had always been the same. Nobody knew. The hospital had been overrun and half its paperwork burned. The woman with the lantern had become a story, and stories don't have addresses. And so for 11 years Walter Crane had been driving to the community veterans lunch at Fort Renwick on the last Friday of every month and sitting in the corner where he could see the door, because some stubborn, unkillable part of him had never stopped believing that one day the door would open and she would walk through it. And now she had. Command Sergeant Major Royce Adler arrived at the dining facility 9 minutes later, because that is how long it took for word to travel from the Chow Hall to the headquarters building that Sergeant First Class Brandt was standing at attention and an old woman was crying, and Walter Crane, whom everybody on post knew as the quiet old man who came every month, was on his knees beside her chair holding her hand. Adler was the senior enlisted soldier on the entire post, a barrel-chested man of 50 with a gray flat top and a reputation for caring more about his soldiers than about almost anything else in the world, and he came through the double doors fast, took one look at the tableau and stopped. Brandt met him and spoke low and fast for 30 seconds. Royce Adler had not heard the story called Lantern by that exact name, but he had heard 100 versions of it across 30 years, and when Brandt said the words "bring them all," the command sergeant major's expression changed in a way his soldiers had never seen. He walked across the dining facility and he stopped in front of Opal Hartwell's table, and this enormous gray man came to attention and held it, and then he did something that made every soldier in that room finally fully understand what they were looking at. He saluted her. He held a salute, crisp and trembling, for an old woman in a faded denim jacket who had been laughed at 20 minutes earlier for dropping a tray. "Ma'am," Command Sergeant Major Adler said, "I don't know your full story yet, but I know enough to know that this whole post owes you something it has not paid. And I would be honored if you would let me start paying it." Opal Hartwell looked at the salute, and at the man holding it, and a strange thing happened to her face, something between grief and a laugh. "Sergeant Major," she said, "the last time a man saluted me, the army took the medal back out of his hands before he could pin it on me, and there it was. There was the wound under the legend. The room did not understand yet. But Walter Crane did, and Walter Crane got back to his feet with a hand on the table, and he turned to face the command sergeant major and the 200 soldiers and he said, loud enough to fill the building, "They cheated her. You all need to hear this, every one of you that laughed and every one of you that didn't. They cheated her out of what she earned, and they did it because she was a woman, and I have spent 50 years trying to find her so I could be a witness to the truth. And now here she is, and I'm not dying with that truth still buried. Sit down. All of you sit down and listen." They sat down. And over the next half hour, in a dining facility where the food went cold on 200 trays, the truth came out, piece by piece, told partly by Walter Crane and partly, reluctantly, by Opal herself, drawn out of her by Brandt's gentle questions and by Adler's quiet insistence and by the simple weight of all those young faces that needed, now, to know. She had been Second Lieutenant Opal Rhodes, of the Army Nurse Corps, 23 years old on the 9th of November. She had volunteered for the Forward Evacuation Hospital when others wanted the safer rear area assignments, because, she said with a small dry smile that was the first hint the room got of the woman underneath the legend, The food was better closer to the fighting, and I was young and stupid and thought I'd live forever. The night the wire broke, she had done what the story said she had done, and a little more besides because the story always left out the worst parts. She had gone out with the lantern over and over across roughly 5 hours. She had dragged wounded men out of the open. And when a medevac helicopter was hit on the pad and went down with its crew still inside, she had gone out to the burning aircraft and pulled 3 men clear before the fuel cooked off. By the time the relief column broke through near dawn, the surgeon's count, written in shaking pencil on a piece of cardboard because the proper forms had burned, put the number of men alive because of her at something north of 40. 40 men who would have died in the dark, who instead went home, who married and had children and grandchildren, who became old men in ball caps in chow halls all over America, because a 23-year-old nurse refused to stay inside where it was safe. The surgeon, a major named Dunmore who would die of a heart attack in 1981, and so could not be called as a witness, had written her up for the Medal of Honor. He had written the recommendation in the days after while he could still remember it clearly, attached the cardboard with the count and sent it up the chain. And the chain had a problem with it. The problem was not the deed. Nobody who had been there disputed the deed. The problem was the year and the place and the fact that the Medal of Honor had never, in all of history, been given to a woman for combat valor, and that the political men far above the forward evacuation hospital did not want the first one to be a nurse in a war already turning sour in the newspapers back home. So the recommendation was studied and reconsidered and sent back for clarification and studied again, and somewhere in that long bureaucratic strangling a colonel named Whitlock, who commanded the medical group from a base far from the wire and had not been within 10 miles of the fighting that night, entered the after-action picture. The official record, when it was finally written, credited the successful defense of the evacuation hospital to the leadership and rapid response of the medical group command under Colonel Whitlock. Opal Rhodes was awarded the Bronze Star, with a V for valor, which was something, a small bright thing, but not the Medal of Honor, not even the Distinguished Service Cross. A Bronze Star, the kind handed out by the 1,000, for a night that should have put her name in the history books. And I'll tell you the part that I never told anybody, Opal said, and her voice had gone very quiet, so that the room had to lean in. I didn't fight it. I could have. Major Dunmore wanted me to. Walter, when they shipped you home, you wrote me letters wanting me to. But I came back from that war and I was so tired, and I had watched men die with their hands in mine, and a medal felt like such a small and ugly thing to fight over when the only thing it was really about was the ones I hadn't been able to save. There were men I didn't reach. There are always the ones you don't reach. And I thought, if I take the Bronze Star and go home and never say a word, then I never have to stand up in front of anybody and have them tell me, to my face, that what I did wasn't enough. So I took it. And I got the tattoo so I wouldn't forget the date or the words. And I went home and became a school nurse in a little town and married a good quiet man and never told a soul. For 50 years. The dining facility was silent. Why now? Brant asked. Why did you come here, ma'am? After all this time. Opal reached down into the canvas tote bag she had set so carefully by her feet, the bag she'd carried like something precious, and she took out a folded newspaper page, soft along the creases from being opened and refolded many times. She smoothed it on the table. It was a story from the Calder paper, 3 weeks old, about a new memorial being built at Fort Renwick. A combat medic memorial wall, a long curve of black granite to be dedicated the coming Saturday, that would carry the names of medics and nurses from the region who had given extraordinary service. The article had a quote from the post commander about honoring the ones whose names had been forgotten. My husband passed in the spring last year, Opal said, and I started thinking about being forgotten. Not in a sad way. Just, you reach a certain age and you start to do the arithmetic. And I read about this wall, about how they wanted to put up the names that got left off, the forgotten ones, and I thought, well, there's a name that ought to be on a wall like that. Not mine. I never cared about mine. But the men I didn't reach that night, they never got anything at all, not even a Bronze Star, because nobody ever wrote them up, because the only person who saw what happened to them was me, and I never said a word. And I thought maybe, before I'm gone, I could give the army their names, so they could go on a wall. She looked up, and her eyes moved around the room, and they were steady again. I've been sitting in that parking lot for 3 Fridays trying to work up the nerve to walk in here and tell somebody. I almost left this morning. And then I dropped my tray. Specialist Tyler Voss put his face in his hands. I want to stop here and tell you about Tyler Voss because what happened next happened mostly inside him, and you can't see the inside of a man from across a dining facility. Voss had grown up in a town not unlike Calder, raised by a grandmother who had served in the Navy and never once talked about it. And he had spent 3 easy years being good at the parts that were easy and avoiding the parts that asked anything real of him. He had built his whole personality around being quick and being funny and never being the one who looked foolish. And he had just watched himself become the cruelest version of the man he was afraid he was. There was no joke quick enough and no laugh loud enough to climb back out of that. And the knowing of it was the first genuinely adult feeling Tyler Voss had ever had. He stood up, his chair scraped, and every eye that had been on Opal swung to him, and the air in the room turned hard, because everyone knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had done. Danny Okafor reached up and tugged his sleeve, a small motion, sit down, don't. But Voss didn't sit down. He walked over to Opal Hartwell's table, and he stood in front of her, and Sergeant First Class Brandt took half a step to intercept him and then stopped, because there was nothing dangerous in the way Voss was moving. There was only a young man with his whole face open and raw. "Ma'am," Voss said, and his voice was nothing like the voice that had called across the room 20 minutes before. "I'm the one that yelled at you. About the salad bar. I'm the one that started it." He stopped. He looked like he might be sick. I can't undo it. I know that. I'm not going to stand here and ask you to tell me it's okay. Because it's not okay, and you shouldn't say it is. I just need you to know that I know what I did. I laughed at you. And you are the bravest person who has ever been in the same room as me and probably the bravest one that ever will be. And I laughed at you for dropping a tray. His jaw was working. "I'm sorry. That's all. I'm so sorry, ma'am." Opal Hartwell looked up at the young man for a long moment. And then she did something that surprised everyone, including very possibly herself. She laughed. A real laugh, small and warm and crinkling all the soft lines of her face. And she reached out and patted the back of his hand where it rested clenched on the table. "Son," she said, "I have been shot at, set on fire, and turned down by the United States Army for a medal I earned with both my hands. Do you really think a smart-mouthed boy and a knocked-over tray are going to be the thing that finally gets me? Sit down. Eat your lunch. And the next time an old woman walks in somewhere looking lost, you get up and help her before you've had time to think about whether it's funny. That's the whole apology I want. The rest of it you can pay forward." And Tyler Voss, 23 years old and humble to the bone, said, "Yes, ma'am," and went back to his table, and he did not throw away the rest of his lunch, because she had told him to eat it, and for the rest of his life he would remember to get up before he had time to wonder whether it was funny. But here is where the story stops being only about a moment in a mess hall and becomes about something harder, because a salute and an apology and a warm laugh do not put a name on a wall, and they do not undo 50 years of a wrong, and Command Sergeant Major Royce Adler was a man who had spent his entire career learning the difference between a feeling and a fix. "Ma'am," Adler said, crouching down so he was at her eye level. "I'm going to ask you to trust me with something. That wall gets dedicated Saturday. 5 days. I want your name on it. I want the names of the men you couldn't reach on it. And I am going to do everything in my power to get the Department of the Army to take a long hard look at a Bronze Star that should have been a great deal more than a Bronze Star. But I need your help, and I need Mr. Crane's help, and I need it fast, because 5 days is not very long to move a mountain." Opal hesitated. The instinct of 50 years, the instinct to not make a fuss, to not stand up and risk being told it wasn't enough, was strong in her, and you could see her fighting it. And it was Walter Crane who tipped the scale. "Opal," he said, "I have carried this for 50 years. I am 79 years old and I have got maybe a few good years left if I'm lucky, and I am telling you the only thing I have ever wanted, the one thing, is to stand somewhere official and say out loud, in front of people who matter, that I am alive because of you and that the Army got it wrong. Don't make me die with it still in my mouth. Let me be your witness. Please. You let me be the one thing I'm good for." And Opal Hartwell, who had refused to fight for herself for 50 years, found that she could not refuse to let an old man fight for himself. "All right," she said. "All right, Walter. We'll make the fuss." What happened over the next 5 days was the kind of thing the Army can do when the right people decide it matters, and the suspense of it, the question of whether they could possibly make it in time, ran underneath every hour. Because the army is a mountain, and mountains do not move in 5 days unless a great many people push at exactly the same moment. The first problem was the name. Every record from that night, what little survived the fire, was filed under Rhodes Opal 2nd Lieutenant. But Opal had married 12 years after the war and lived the second half of her life as Opal Hartwell, and the awards database and the veterans' records had never been cross-referenced, so that for 50 years the legend called Lantern and the school nurse named Hartwell had been two completely separate people in the eyes of the system, connected by nothing except the memory of an old woman and the heart of an old man. Adler put 2 soldiers from the personnel office on it that same afternoon, and at 9 o'clock that night a young sergeant named Prionaire came running across the parking lot waving a printout, shouting that she had it. Rhodes and Hartwell were the same social security number. It was airtight. The second problem was the citation. A Bronze Star can become a Medal of Honor only through a process that normally takes years, that requires sworn statements and corroborating witnesses and documentation that 50-year-old burned paperwork could not easily supply. But it could be done faster, in extraordinary cases, with a living eyewitness whose testimony was beyond dispute and the original recommending officer's paperwork in hand. And here 2 pieces of luck fell into place. Walter Crane had not just been carrying the story in his heart. He had been carrying it in a shoebox. For 50 years he had kept every letter Opal Rhodes ever wrote him, copies of every letter he wrote the Army, and a carbon copy, yellowed and brittle, of a sworn statement Major Dunmore had given in 1972 supporting the original recommendation, mailed to Walter himself with a note that read, "In case they bury it, somebody outside the system should have this." Major Dunmore had been smarter than the men who outranked him. He had known. And the third problem was the legacy of Colonel Whitlock, who had retired a brigadier general, who had died honored in 1996 with the defense of the evacuation hospital listed among his accomplishments, and whose family ran a small foundation in his name. Correcting the record meant saying out loud that a celebrated general had taken credit for the courage of a nurse he had left in the dark. It was the kind of thing institutions hate to do, and for one tense day on the Thursday before the dedication, it looked as if the whole effort might stall on exactly that rock, as a staff officer at a headquarters far away expressed concern, in the careful language of people protecting themselves about reputational considerations. It was Command Sergeant Major Royce Adler who broke it, and he broke it with a phone call that the soldiers who overheard it would talk about for years. He did not raise his voice. He said into the phone in a tone of perfect flat calm that he had 200 soldiers on his post who had personally witnessed the truth, that he had a living Medal of Honor's worth of testimony from a man who'd been dragged out of a kill zone by his collar, that the woman in question was 78 years old and might not get another Saturday like this one, and that if the Department of the Army was more worried about the reputation of a dead general than the recognition of a living hero, then he would be making that exact comparison to every newspaper that would take his call, starting with the one in Calder and working his way up. And then he said, more quietly, "Sir, I have spent 30 years telling young soldiers that this institution takes care of its own and tells the truth even when it's expensive. Please don't make a liar out of me 5 days before I have to stand in front of all of them. Do the right thing. I'll wait." The right thing got done. It did not get done all the way, not in 5 days, because some things cannot be rushed, and the formal Medal of Honor process would take another 14 months and a vote and a ceremony at a level far above Fort Renwick. But it got done far enough. The Department of the Army issued, on the Friday afternoon 1 week after Opal Hartwell dropped her tray in the dining facility, a formal correction to the historical record of the 9th of November, acknowledging that the defense of the forward evacuation hospital and the preservation of its wounded had been due primarily to the extraordinary and repeated valor of then 2nd Lieutenant Opal Rhodes, Army Nurse Corps, and announcing that her award was being upgraded and forwarded for the highest consideration, and they authorized, effective immediately, the addition of her name and the names of the men she had not been able to reach, names Walter Crane had also kept in his shoebox, written down from memory in 1973 when the memory was still fresh, to the Combat Medic Memorial Wall in time for the Saturday dedication. Saturday came clear and cold, with a hard bright autumn sky over Fort Renwick, and the dedication of the Combat Medic Memorial Wall drew a crowd far larger than anyone had planned for, because word travels fast in a small town and faster on a small post, and everyone wanted to be there. The long curve of black granite stood gleaming at the center of the parade field, and the names cut into it caught the light, and near the place of honor, freshly engraved so that the cut edges were still bright against the polished black, was the name Opal Rhodes, and beneath it, in a cluster, the names of 8 young men who had died in the dark on the 9th of November and had waited 50 years for anyone to write them down. Opal Hartwell sat in the front row in a folding chair, in the same faded denim jacket, because it was the nicest thing she owned and she would not let anyone buy her something new for the occasion, with Walter Crane on one side of her holding her hand and Command Sergeant Major Royce Adler standing behind her like a wall. The post commander spoke. A general had flown in from a headquarters far away and he spoke too, and read the formal correction aloud, and his voice caught on the words extraordinary and repeated valor. And then Sergeant First Class Eli Brandt was invited to the microphone, because Command Sergeant Major Adler had decided that the person who should explain to the crowd what Opal Rhodes meant was the person who had been keeping her legend alive without even knowing she was real. Brandt stood at the microphone in front of several hundred people and he did not have notes. He told them the story of Lantern the same way he told it to every class of new medics. The dark, the dying generators, the thin blade of light moving low across the ground, the voice saying a wounded man's name. And then he told them the part he had only learned that week. He told them that he had taught this story for 6 years believing it was a beautiful myth, and that one ordinary Friday he had looked up from his coffee and seen the myth reach for the salt. He told them about the tattoo. And then he turned from the microphone and faced Opal Hartwell in her folding chair, and came to attention and said, "Ma'am, I have one thing left to do and then I'll sit down." He looked out at the crowd, and his eyes found the dozen or so young soldiers from the dining facility scattered through it, Voss and Cobb and Okafor and the rest, the ones who had laughed, who had come to the dedication because they could not have stayed away, who had not slept much that week. "On the first day of every class," Brandt said, "I teach my medics 3 words, and when I teach them I have them stand, because some things you receive standing up. So I'm going to ask everyone here who has ever been a medic or a nurse or a corpsman, anyone who ever went toward the wounded when everything in you wanted to go the other way, to please stand." The old men in their ball caps stood. The young medics in uniform stood. Across the parade field, in ones and twos and then in a wave hundreds of people rose to their feet. "And the rest of you," Brandt said, "the rest of us who never had to do what she did, who get to be alive and whole and standing here because people like her exist, I'd ask you to stand too. All of you, stand up." And the entire field stood. Several hundred people came to their feet on a cold, bright Saturday and stood facing one frail old woman in a faded denim jacket. And the only person still seated in that whole vast crowd was Opal Rhodes herself, who had been laughed at in a mess hall 8 days before for dropping a tray, and who was looking up now at a field full of standing people with both hands pressed to her mouth and tears running freely down the soft, deep lines of her face. "Bring them all," Eli Brandt said into the microphone, his voice breaking on the last word, and several hundred voices said it back to her, ragged and overlapping and enormous, rolling across the parade field and off the granite wall and up into that hard, bright sky. "Bring them all." Walter Crane helped her to her feet so she could see them all standing, and she stood there beside him, 2 old soldiers from a war most of the people in that crowd had only read about, and she looked at the wall with her name on it and the 8 names beneath it, and Walter leaned down close to her ear, and whatever he said, only she heard it, but she laughed and cried at the same time and gripped his hand and nodded. What he said, he told me himself after, "Opal, they were enough. You were always enough. And now there's a wall that says so." In the weeks that followed, things settled the way things do, but they did not settle back to where they had been. The formal Medal of Honor process moved forward through its long machinery, and 14 months later, in a room far grander than a dining facility, an old woman in the same denim jacket, because she still would not buy a new one, would receive from the highest office in the land the medal that had been taken out of a surgeon's hands 50 years before, with Walter Crane in the front row, the witness at last. But all of that was still to come. What changed first and changed fastest was the dining facility at Fort Renwick. Della Frost, who had never in 29 years allowed a piece of decoration on the walls of her chow hall beyond the regulation menu boards, had a framed photograph hung by the double doors, where everyone entering would see it. It was a photograph of the parade field on dedication day, the whole crowd on its feet, and the small seated figure of Opal Rhodes in the front row, and beneath it a brass plate that read, in plain block letters, "Bring them all." And underneath that, in smaller letters, Della had added a line of her own, technically against about 4 regulations and which no inspector ever once dared to mention. The line read, "You never know who's holding the tray." Specialist Tyler Voss requested a transfer that fall, not away from Fort Renwick, but into the combat medic course, retraining into a field he knew nothing about and starting near the bottom of it, which was not a thing a man builds his pride by doing, and that was rather the point. On the first day, Brant wrote 3 words on the whiteboard and asked the class to stand to receive the creed, and Voss stood with his throat tight, and when the others sat he stayed up 1 extra second, just for her. Danny Okafor put in the same week. They graduated together. Voss finished first in his cohort on the practical exam, the part where you keep a casualty alive with your hands shaking, and afterward he drove out to Calder and showed Opal the certificate, and she looked at it a long time and said, "Now you're useful," which from Opal was very nearly a coronation, and the boy who had once laughed at her hung it where he could see it every morning. Opal moved into a little house in Calder, close enough to drive to the post, and Command Sergeant Major Adler saw to it that she had a standing invitation to address the new medics on the first day of every class, an invitation she accepted about half the time, depending on her needs. On the days she came, she did not tell war stories. She told them, instead, about the men she had not reached, and made them learn the 8 names off the wall. And she told them, every time, the same thing, which became as much a part of the creed at Fort Renwick as the 3 words themselves. "The medal is not the point," she said. "The wall is not the point. The point is that somewhere out there, right now, there is a person sitting in the dark who thinks nobody is coming. And your whole job, your only job, is to be the light that proves them wrong. Go toward the dark. Bring them all. And if you can't bring them all, bring as many as you can, and let that be enough, because it is. It always was." And Walter Crane came to every class she addressed, and sat in the back and never said a word, because he had finally said the one he'd been carrying, and the rest he was content to simply witness. There is a thing that happens when you spend a long time being invisible. You start to believe the invisibility is the truth about you, rather than a failure of the people who can't see. Opal Rhodes had believed, for 50 years, that the smallness of her recognition was the measure of what she'd done, and she had nearly carried the whole true weight of it into the grave name unspoken, simply because she'd been afraid that if she asked to be seen, someone would say it wasn't enough. Took a drop tray. It took a careless boy's cruel joke and a mess sergeant's roar and a senior medic who happened to glance up from his coffee at the exact moment an old woman reached for the salt. It took 50 years of an old man's stubborn refusal to let a truth die in a shoebox, and a command sergeant major willing to make an expensive phone call and mean it. The whole machinery of recognition turned on 100 small accidents of timing, and that is worth sitting with because it means that somewhere near you, right now, there is almost certainly someone whose true size you cannot see. The quiet one. The old one. The one who fumbles the tray and seems, for all the world, like nobody at all. And the only thing standing between that person and the dark they think nobody's coming to lift them out of, sometimes, is whether you bother to get up before you've had time to wonder if it's funny. Opal Rhodes lived another 6 years after the day the mess hall laughed. She died in her sleep in the little house in Calder, in the early spring, the same season she'd buried her husband. Her funeral filled a church that could not hold the crowd, so that soldiers and old veterans stood out in the cold churchyard with their hats off. They buried her with full military honors, and folded a flag into a tight blue triangle and placed it in the hands of Walter Crane, who had no family of his own left and whom she had named, in the end, the closest thing to it. And at the graveside, when the words had all been said, Eli Brant stepped forward and asked everyone who had ever gone toward the wounded, and everyone who was alive because someone had, to please stand. And in a cold churchyard in a small worn town with a single stoplight, the whole crowd rose to its feet around an old woman's grave, and said the 3 words one last time, soft now, a benediction instead of a creed. Bring them all. The Combat Medic Memorial Wall still stands at the center of the parade field at Fort Renwick, and her name is still cut into the black granite. The cut edges gone smooth now with weather and time, with 8 names clustered beneath it. New medics still get marched out to read those names on the first day. And in the dining facility by the double doors where every soldier passes coming in to eat, the framed photograph still hangs, the whole crowd on its feet, the small seated figure in the faded denim jacket, and the brass plate that reads "Bring them all," and under it, against 4 regulations, the line that nobody has ever taken down. You never know who's holding the tray. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me to put it together, then do the 3 small things that help it find the next person. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because I've got more like this one and I want you here when they drop. And leave a comment telling me what city or town you're watching from, and if you've got someone in your own life, a quiet one, an old one, the one everybody overlooks, tell me about them too. Because the whole point of a story like this is that we start looking a little harder at the people right in front of us. Thank you for staying to the end. I'll see you in the next one.